Welcome to Kill the Cat. In this episode, we're looking at the wonderfully sweet film from 2017, Paddington 2, directed and co-written by Paul King. The film uses setup and payoff in a way that stands out as both incredibly well structured and just a whole lot of fun. We're going to be talking about why this is important, some of the things they did to achieve it, and give you some of our learnings on how to do it in your own writing. Now, with setup out of the way, enjoy the episode. Welcome to Kill the Cat. Today we are talking about
one of the best movies of all time.
It's up there for me. I'm actually genuinely excited to talk about this movie, because it's one that's been recommended to me for ages, and I just never got around to watching it until we decided to do this episode. And it is the sweetest movie. So many moments where I had tears. I was like, Paddington. And yeah, we're talking about Paddington 2 today.
Yes, specifically the second one. The first one is also really good and charming, but there's just something that feels very complete about the second one. And just the best movie it can be. I went to go see this around Christmas period with my whole family, my entire family as adults at this point. We all loved this movie. We had such a good time watching it.
And so the reason we're talking about this film today, we kind of noticed after our last recording session, we've been hitting on a couple of notes really frequently. And that is the importance of good setups and payoffs for Act 3. And so we're like, well, what movie does that well? And Kat had written this in the notes months before of Paddington as a prime example of setups and payoffs. So that's kind of why we wanted to talk about this film.
Yeah. Okay, this sounds really simple and basic, that if something happens in Act 3, you set it up in Act 1. But as a script reader, this is the note I find myself giving all the time. Just we get to a character beat, and it's usually a character announcing exposition in the moment that exposition is relevant. And that it
just takes the momentum away from them.
I learned a term for this and I love it. It's called when you bump on something. So when you bump on something, it's when you're being taken out of the movie or reminded you're watching a movie, or if you're reading, it's a reminder that this is a screenplay, and you go, oh. And the really easy and simple way to counteract that is just put it in the first or second act. We talked about The Matrix a couple of episodes ago, how basically Acts 1 and 2 are exposition for Act 3. And that's why Act 3 works so well.
Yeah, it's setting up the world, it's setting up the stakes, and it's setting up skills and abilities that Neo will use in the third act.
Yeah, and it can also be used for comedy. When people ask me what my favorite film is, I don't think I have an answer for that, but the one I tend to go to is Hot Fuzz, because there's just so many setups and payoffs, and that third act is just constant payoffs of comedy, and I love that so much.
Yeah, and even Emperor's New Groove, with Kuzco and Pacha having to team up to get the potion at the end. They can only do that because they had to escape the canyon with the crocodiles at the bottom.
Yes, and that's what kind of makes those moments feel really magical, and it's why I was really angry at Free Guy, more angry than I should have been at some stupid Ryan Reynolds movies.
You're still going on about this. This was a few months ago you watched this
Specifically movie. That scene where he pulls out Captain America's shield. It still annoys me so much. We're off topic. I could rant about Free Guy for a while. Okay, let's begin Screenwriting 101. Let's start with act structure.
What's an act?
What's a scene?
What's a plot?
I thought people just improvised everything, and that's what made movies, right?
Well, I mean, Middleditch and Schwartz came out pretty good.
That's true, but because they knew their act structure, and because they know how to do setups and payoffs.
Well, that's very true. I'm a ghost.
We'll
find out about you later. All right, so acts in its most basic form is just a way of splitting up your film. Typically, it's broken into 3 in a lot of modern media. Act 1, you're kind of seeing just the world as it is. Then you break into Act 2 when something changes. So in this movie, I would probably say that's when Paddington goes to prison.
Yeah, it's when he gets arrested as the Act 1 crisis.
And then Act 3 comes along towards the end of the film. And that's where you start moving into the final confrontations and that kind of thing. So that kind of happens when Paddington breaks out of prison.
Yes. You can tell when your Act 3 comes because your character has just had their lowest moment. Which for Paddington, he thought the Browns forgot about him.
And then he escaped, and the crew who he escaped with left as well. So he was all by himself.
I made a note that Paddington's never been on his own before. He got raised by his aunt and uncle, and he went to London, and then the Browns adopted him, and then he's lived with them, and then he went to prison, and he met friends, and this is the first time he's been on his own.
Yeah.
He's a Saddington.
A Saddington, that's...
I think that's what you called it.
That's what I called it. I was sending cat notes as I was watching the movie.
It was very fun.
But yeah, so that's your typical 3-act structure. Act 3, obviously, with everything happening there and it being the climax, it's a really good time for payoffs. Not a great time for introducing new things. That tends to just create these bumps where you're like, why am I learning this now?
Yeah, look, your audience is tired by Act 3. They don't want to process new information like an hour and a half in. They just want to be rewarded for all the attention they've given your film earlier.
And they are invested, ideally,
Yes.
at that point. If you've engaged them through, they want to see what happens to the protagonist, how they're going to overcome the, this like lowest moment they've just experienced.
And yeah, of course, there are exceptions to this, but hey, we're talking about a kid's film as well.
Yeah.
Kids films are so... I was actually looking over what episodes we choose to do. Kids films are great to study for up-and-coming screenwriters.
So I had a whole point about this and why good setup and payoff is really important, especially in kids media. So there's a lot of research that points to kids using repetition as a way of learning things because, kids they don't know anything and they have to learn everything about everything, and that's just baffling to think about, like how much they have to take in and figure out. But so one of the things they do is they use repetition, and that's why they tend to watch the same movie like 100 times. So anyone who is a parent out there or grew up with younger siblings probably knows like their siblings watching the same movie. So we had Barbie, the Princess and the Pauper, and Anastasia were two movies that were just on repeat in our house for a good few years. But the reason they do that is as they watch these movies over and over again, they begin to be able to predict and understand the outcomes, which in turn helps develop like logical thinking and their understanding of like cause and effect relationships. And so when you have really good setup and payoff, that helps them to pick up on the like, oh, this thing leads to this thing. And when you've got a single like skill in a character like Mr. Brown doing yoga, or when you've got a single prop like the coin behind Paddington's ear, that's something they can latch onto really well for helping to develop that. And I think, that's like the science of it, and that's why it's important. But then kids' movies are also just like, you want to keep things simple for kids. And so having really good setups and payoffs means you've got less things to track. They can kind of go like, oh, I remember seeing that thing earlier.
I think that's what creates a lot of nostalgia. And we still have that moment of like, oh, it's that thing. I remember that thing. And it makes you feel smart.
Yeah.
It usually comes as well. Not so much in Paddington because it's something called a flat change arc, which we will get to in a much later episode, not this one, where Paddington doesn't change. But like it can also lead to like that big character revelation.
Yeah.
Okay, this is just the one that's in my head, but it's Doctor Strange being like, do Mama have come to bargain, and doing the time loop because we've seen him do that earlier. And it's that moment like, oh, that's okay. It's not about him. That's his big character change, and that's that little thing that was mentioned earlier and set up, and now we're here. I just really like that as one of the more creative Marvel climaxes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, and other reasons to do your setup and pay off well, it shows character growth and creativity, like Paddington using the ladder to get between the trains after he used it to climb the windows, right? Like that's him being clever. Or using the toffee apples. This was something that was just a gag of him getting his mouth stuck on a toffee apple at the fair. But then he uses that to progress along the train because they're super sticky.
Mr. Brown throwing coconuts.
Yes.
That's my favorite one, I think.
Yeah. No.
Let's use that one as like a really good example of like a setup and payoff.
I will also add, get set up twice.
It does, yes.
Yeah, so this is something that is also a really good habit to do if you can. Set it up the first time, remind your audience of it a little bit later, then pay it off. So yeah, so it gets set up the very first time.
It's like coconuts is a young man's game.
Yeah.
Mr. Brown is going through a midlife crisis in this movie.
Yep.
He didn't get his promotion.
Yep.
And Paddington is now like, and now he paints his hair.
And does acrobatics.
Yes.
And then we get a little scene later on of him in the 70s, like hitting a bullseye.
And then Mrs. Brown like swoons into his arms and she's like, oh, what a young, vibrant man.
Yeah. What happened to that man?
Oh,
He's gone now. I think she actually says that, though. That's what leads us into that flashback.
That's so true. But in the third act, because we've seen that, he has to stop Phoenix Buchanan, who I just thought of as Hugh Grant the whole movie.
Yeah, it's Hugh Grant playing himself, right?
So, and he's just having the time of his life.
He's clearly
He's great to watch in this.
It's such a weird pick because I've only ever seen him in like rom-coms and like kind of sappy films. And there's so many jokes about like, you've disgraced the noble profession of acting.
Oh yeah, and there was one was like, actors are some of the most evil, devious people on the planet. Which is fun to make an actor say.
Yep.
There's also a little one which is exit bear pursued by an actor, which I like.
Oh gosh, where were we going?
We totally tangent. We're talking about Mr. Brown throwing a ball to hit Hugh Grant on the head to defeat the villain.
Yeah, and so that's, been set up this whole time and you get the bullseye.
Is that, and he does his acrobatics to do the splits.
Yes.
And that's amazing. I remember just bursting out loud in the theatre. Like the first time I saw that, it's like, open your mind and the legs will follow. And it's just him splitting across this train while like yoga music plays.
And what I love is that it's like there's nothing too small in this
let's
film.
talk about small setups. Yeah. Small setups are great. I think when people think of setup and payoff, they think of big things.
Yeah.
But it's like little things. If you can catch on a first watch, that's very impressive. But also little things you can bury for people to find on the next watch.
Yeah, exactly. Another one that I almost missed, Mrs. Brown dives in after Paddington when he goes into the water, and Mrs. Brown has been training to swim the channel. There is a gag as well in the credits where she swam across it, but then forgot her passport, so she had to swim back.
Yes, and Paddington makes a note. It's like, I don't know why anyone would want to do that when you can take a boat.
Yeah, but there's all these little things. The coin in the ear starts off as just this sweet little, gag, and then we get reminded of it later again when Paddington pulls it out to see if he can pay for the book. And then it becomes really important when it's how Paddington calls home.
Yes. That's my favourite kind of payoff, is when it's something sweet and like innocent in the beginning, and then it has like a major plot or like emotional beat later.
Yeah.
I always love it when movies do that. Yeah, and then like little things like Mrs. Bird, Phoenix Buchanan doesn't know her name until she drops in and like grabs a air quotes gun to shoot at him. And he's like, oh, now you remember my name. I can't do a Scottish accent, but...
Yeah.
It's Mrs. Weasley going, now you remember my name.
Yeah, and there's like little things like Judy's newspaper photo helping the family figure out the organ and
steam trains.
The steam trains, which becomes really important. One of the ones I love that doesn't really have much bearing on the story, but is just sweet.
Much bearing.
Is that the Colonel and Mrs. Kitts get together.
That's
because of
sweet.
Paddington. And so, you start off with Colonel very depressed in his house and Miss Kitt having no luck in the dating scene. And then Paddington helps them both and they get together.
He
and they're just kind
windows and he can see her at last.
Yeah. And they do the cute little like escalator, elevator gag. And it's like, that doesn't change the story in any way beyond the Colonel calls in some favors with his Air Force buddies to get Aunt Lucy over. But it's just sweet because you get to see them then throughout the film together.
Yes. Well, one of the most important setups and payoffs for this movie is showing how Paddington has an effect on Windsor Gardens. In the opening scene, everyone really loves Paddington. Why? He gives the cyclist a sandwich because
she gets grumpy in the morning if she doesn't have breakfast.
Someone else always forgets his keys unless Paddington reminds him. He helps the garbage man study.
Yeah, so he can study while collecting the garbage.
So when Paddington's in prison, you get to see how much worse Windsor Gardens is without him, which is the big theme, because the theme of the Paddington movies is basically we need to see the best in everything.
Well, yeah, it's the line.
If we're kind and polite, the world will be right.
That's the one. What a theme. What a line to carry through the movie.
And that sounds like it would be preachy.
But it's not.
It's really not.
Because
very
Paddington
done.
is so genuine and sweet.
We were chatting about what D&D class Paddington would be. He's a paladin.
Oath of Manners.
Oath of Manners paladin.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then in the third act, we have all these people helping him.
Yeah.
So the garbage man comes and gives him a ride and helps him be a bin.
That's
and then
right, yeah.
Paddington gets a donut. It's pretty good being a bin.
Yeah. Nothing to see here, officer. Just a bin. I love that the officers are just not even dealing with that. Just
I'm good. So yeah, they all run out to help the Brown start the car. Mm-hmm. And then he So like we said earlier, a lot of this movie is the prison. And just watching Paddington go into like this really depressing place and just brighten it up. Like literally he turns all the uniforms like a nice pink.
Yeah.
He meets my favorite character, Knuckles. I have to give you Knuckles' description in the screenplay because it's amazing. Okay. Knuckles turns to reveal a huge granite-faced bruiser. This is a man who has faced 1,000 enemies and defeated them all, except perhaps himself. Best character description.
It's so good. I love with the prison as well, the escape scene, because they do it like a dollhouse. Like the warden reads. So the warden, another setup payoff that happens pretty quick is Paddington asks for a story. He says no. And then once the prison changes, the warden reads everyone a bedtime story. But then we get like the dollhouse to see the crew escaping. But we go through all the rooms that we've had set up throughout the prison. So we go through the laundry and then the dining room and then into the kitchen, and then they go out through the bell tower. And I was like, that's just nice, like having put the thought in to like prep us for the locations they're going to go through.
Yeah, another one like prepping characters. It's like the judge in the trial could have been just a judge. Yeah. But I had like in my notes in the beginning, it seems like a lot of scenes that don't, like they're really fun and they're giving you kind of like Charlie Chaplin vibes. Yeah. But they don't seem to connect. So like Paddington at the barbershop, Paddington washing windows. Yeah. Because he needs money to buy a present for Aunt Lucy.
They're kind of disconnected physical comedy sketches.
Yeah, and you're like, this is charming, I'm into it. But then you get to the trial and you're like, oh, like the judge is the man, like the hair he cut at the bar, and then we get him again. Not super plot important, but it's funny.
But just fun.
To watch him faint into a pavlova.
I have been spilled upon with chilled liquid, Gertrude.
And his wife is just like, oh, okay, calm down.
Shush.
Yeah, so he brightens up the whole prison. There's that amazing scene of when the Browns come to visit and then they're in the window and everyone introduces themselves, which I love that scene.
And then Mr. Brown turns off the light, not the microphone.
Oh, Mr. Brown. Yeah, it's Paddington seeing the best in everyone. It's walking into a place that everyone's like, oh no, big scary prisoners. And he goes, they just need some cuddles and some love and some desserts. And they're going to be good people. And then they are the people at the very end. So we have Mrs. Brown diving in to save Paddington from like the locked chest, which is like a good payoff for the canal. It reflects the opening when Aunt Lucy dives in to get him from the river. Yeah. But Mrs. Brown isn't strong enough. And then all the prisoners come back. Yeah. And they dive down and they all save Paddington together. And then because it's a kid's movie and you kind of say your thesis out loud, like even Hugh Grant is essentially like, his agent says no one will work with him because he thinks he's so genius. No one can work with him ever. He goes to the prison and he does his big show, which is no longer a one-man show, but features all the prisoners. I also really did like the treasure hunt. Isn't really a big part of the story. Like it's there, it's the stakes, but they have all like the locations. And I feel like that could have gone like very national treasure. But instead it's like, no, there's a marker on each of these locations. I'm going to go get these letters. Yeah. Oh, the letters is a melody. It's going to open the organ, which we saw in Act 1.
And we don't go to all the locations. We only go to, I think, 2 or 3 of the locations. Because that's all we need to get what's happening.
Because it's not thematically important.
No.
And that's like a good tip in itself. Like if something's not contributing to your theme or your characters, even though I was looking, I'm like, oh, like a treasure hunt would have been really cool. Yeah. But it's not very relevant, so it's not there.
Because Paddington's locked up.
Yes.
That's the bigger issue here.
The stakes are getting him out of prison. Yeah. Which is why the Browns need to find the book. But it's not about the actual like treasure hunt. And like the treasure itself isn't even that important because Paddington doesn't need treasure, he needs Aunt Lucy.
Yeah. There's a version of this where Paddington probably could have just taken the book from the train, and if Buchanan hadn't accidentally pushed one of the buttons to shut the organ again, he could have just taken the treasure, because that's what Buchanan wanted. Yes. And Paddington wanted the book, he didn't want the treasure. So it's like, there's a version of this where they could have both gotten what they wanted and walked away.
If only they communicated. And Paddington would have just given it to him. He thought, oh yeah, that's fine, as long as I can give the book to my Aunt Lucy. I just want to get her a good birthday present. That's all I want. Yeah. Because he's a sweet soul. There's no right for this movie to be this good.
Right? So, with all that said, I kind of put down in my notes, because I think it'd be good to go through some like advice for writers in how do you actually put this stuff into your script. Because it's, you know, one thing to say, oh, do setup and payoff, but it's another thing to actually fit all the pieces together. Like Paddington does that really well, but it takes some work and it takes some drafting of your script.
Which is why this sounds really simple, but again, it's just something a lot of scripts I read have missed.
And drafting is going to be really important in this process. And I think back Uncut Gems, through the 100 and something scripts they did, there are all these tiny little plots that are happening underneath that you don't notice until you watch it like 3 or 4 times.
I think there was the scene we broke down had like 11 different plot threads going at once.
The more you can fit in, basically, the more interesting and the more intense you can make your climax. And so one of the techniques that I was taught, I don't know what you've got, but is doing this sort of circle format for your script outline. So Dan Harmon talks about this. I learned it off a guy called Seth Worley. But basically the idea is you go around your clock like a clock face. Act 1 is from like 12 till, 12 to 2:30 or 3. 3 to 9 is your Act 2, and then 9 to 12 is your Act 3. But what you can do is basically list out all your points, all the things that happen, all the props that are introduced, and just see if they've got something on the other side of the clock. So everything from 1 to 6 should have something you can mirror from 6 to 12. And one of the reasons it's good to lay out like that is that if you feel like you've got something missing or you've got space to fill on one side of the clock, you can look to the other side and see, well, what have I got there that I haven't paid off already? How can I pay that off? One of the things I also have kind of noticed is that you tend to get a lot of like Act 3 payoffs tend to be set up in Act 1. Whereas Act 2 tends to sort of contain its setups and payoffs. And so often the earlier something is set up, the later it'll be paid off. So things around the midpoint tend to happen pretty quickly. So in this movie, an example of that would be the warden telling a bedtime story. That gets introduced into Act 2 and pays off just before we end Act 2. Whereas, the Chacrobatics is like one of the last things to get paid off, and it's one of the first things to get set up.
Is that true? I've never thought about that before. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like just keeping that in mind as a way, like, because the things that we set up earliest should be the most important for the story. The things we set up a bit later, like, we probably don't need to keep around for as long, so get rid of them. And then, the third thing would just be try to include a reminder in there if you can. So like with Miss Bird pulling the coin, Paddington then pulls the coin for the book and then uses it to call home. Henry is a dab hand at the Coconut Shy, and then we get the Bullseye Brown flashback, and then we use the ball to knock out Phoenix Buchanan. And then, if you need your character to have a certain skill at some point in the movie, make sure you've set up a reason for them to have that skill. Yeah,
so the whole, why does Judy have her own newspaper printing press? Okay, she broke up with her boyfriend and had her heart broken. She goes, okay, I'm going to make a newspaper, no boys.
Yeah.
So that's why she has a printing press. That's super useful.
Jonathan can drive a train because he's really into steam trains. And then, Mary Brown, as we said, can go in after Paddington because she's been practicing to swim the channel.
Yes, and we're given all of that. I also liked how they set up Mrs. Brown as she's an adventure writer and she's looking for her own adventures, and that was the only character motivation I needed.
And an illustrator.
Yes.
And those sketches become really useful later on because she's the one who kind of looks at the sketches and sees that they are Phoenix Buchanan.
Yeah, and as I said, again, it sounds really obvious to not announce that your character is a really good sketch artist in the same scene where they suddenly need to sketch. But I see that so often.
Yeah.
So this is my writing process for this. And this is kind of what I do to stop from getting paralyzed when I'm writing. And this is me. Everyone is going to have their own. So I generally have a loose outline. I like to know where I'm going roughly in terms of character arc and theme, and sometimes a plot payoff. Sometimes I don't know what it is until I get there. But as I go, I might find new things I want to throw in. I want this for the character. I want this plot. Oh, I know now this is going to pay off in Act 3. I have a separate document and I just write those things down.
Yeah.
Separately. So I don't go back. Some people might like to go back and edit as they go. I don't.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I'm doing my next draft, I go back at all those things I need set up earlier. And that's how I write the next draft.
Yeah.
And I just keep doing that until I feel like everything is set up and paid off. So that's, again, what works for me. Some people love having perfect outlines before they start writing. Some people like making it up as they go along and seeing where they end up. And then I would say this is also really good for feedback because feedback is really hard to give. So if someone gives you a script and they say, I want feedback, don't nitpick the plot. Like, if there's a massive plot hole, sure, tell them. But don't nitpick the plot. Think about why things feel plot convenient. So instead of being like, this didn't make sense because da-da-da, and doing what I call CinemaSins feedback, being like, this feels plot convenient. Can you set this up earlier? This felt out of character for me. Can you make this a character thing for them earlier?
Yeah.
That's actually what people need to hear, not this wouldn't make sense in the real world.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess we're kind of getting into takeaways there. But that's, yeah.
I had written something very similar in the idea of like, avoid coincidences, no coinkydinks, instead replace them with payoffs.
Yes.
Nothing should ever come out of the blue as like, well, that was convenient.
Yes, unless you're writing like The Nice Guys, which we talked about.
Yeah, and even then a lot of that stuff gets established and, you know, it's a lot of dumb luck, but that's kind of the humor. I love that film so much.
I feel like that was my Paddington too, of like, you told me to watch that for like a year, and I knew I would like it, but I just didn't. And then I finally watched it for the podcast. I'm like, this is amazing.
Yeah, but so try to replace any coincidences with payoffs. And yeah, make sure you've set up anything that is going to become important, whether it's important thematically, whether it's important for a gag, whether it's important for, you know, the plot in Act 3. Like, make sure you've given it some reason to exist, and it'll feel like it has a reason to exist and a purpose.
Especially if you find yourself having your characters explain their motivations as they're doing something. That's the biggest one. That's the biggest bump. If a character's about to do a thing and someone's like, why would you do that thing? And they have to give like a big monologue or speech or like a lot of reasons about why they're about to do it, that probably needs to be earlier. Or it's a reveal later.
Yeah.
It's, you don't know why they're doing it, reveal later. It's one of those two. But if you reveal something, we talked about this in Shutter Island, you also got to put in clues.
Yeah. A reveal is still something that has been set up.
Yes.
Yeah.
We talked about one of my favorite reveals, which is Kilgrave's I Love You in Jessica Jones. You can then rewatch Jessica Jones and then see that's his real motivation.
Yeah, because there's a reality of if he was trying to kill her, she'd be dead.
Yeah.
He would have done it way sooner.
I think my biggest thing here is there's no moment too small. Even going back and looking at Paddington 1, very charming, still like it, great characters. It doesn't quite have the same attention to detail that the second one does. There isn't that constant setup and payoff. If you want to go, again, Hot Fuzz, I think it's just perfect.
Brilliant.
For no detail too small. Everything is like a little setup, a little payoff, little hints, references. Yeah, and if you find yourself still needing to introduce a lot of exposition in Act 3, there's probably a problem with your earlier acts that really shouldn't be there.
Yeah. Look, I think my takeaways would probably be pretty similar. Trying to remember, you know, there's a lot of value in drafting. So even though it hurts and sucks.
It hurts so badly.
Multiple drafts.
Multiple drafts, sometimes rewriting them from the beginning.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of writers say that that's something they really find helpful for their process of like writing the piece fully and then deleting it and rewriting it just based on what you remember of it.
Yes.
And that way you're kind of getting rid of any unimportant details, because if you didn't remember them, they probably weren't important. But yeah, the more that can be set up, the more that can be paid off, the more you're going to have fun with your film.
That's very true.
Thanks for listening to our episode on Paddington 2. We hope it paid off well for you. If you'd like to keep up to date with the podcast, make sure you click follow or subscribe on whichever platform you're on. And if you have the time, leave us a review or tell a friend. It helps us grow the show and bring you even more episodes like our upcoming ones on the Toy Story series, A Quiet Place, and Phineas and Ferb. You can also find us on Instagram or Facebook, so feel free to come say hi, share your thoughts. Until next time, this has been Kill the Cat. Uncut Gems when we were talking. Uncut Jams.
Uncut Jams?
Uncut Jams.
Uncut Jams. Oh no.
Paddington.
Kind of polite. The world would be right.